ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. When we think about the message of Imam Hussain alayhi salam and where that message is shared right now in every country in the world, people all throughout the world are remembering the message of Imam Hussain. They're sharing in the same message that Imam Hussain came to share. I want to talk a little bit about the history of Islam in America so we can understand better and appreciate more what Imam Hussain means and how it evolved and came to what it is now, especially in the West, especially in America. There's probably the first time that there was any history of Islam in America. Through some research that I've done, it shows that some of the first times that there was any signs of Islam in this country was some Native Americans. Some Native Americans, it said by their names, they had Muslim names. It mentions that they used to do trade with some of the Moors that would come from certain parts of Africa. And they would come here. Many of them were Muslim. And so this was some of the first interaction, or maybe some of the first time that Islam ever came or was in this country for so many hundreds and hundreds of years before. After that time, probably the next time that Islam really became outward or people began to know about this deen and this religion, at least in America, was around the 60s. The late 60s, 70s, people began to find out about the Nation of Islam. There was a group, and they were called the Nation of Islam. This group called the Nation of Islam, they had some beliefs which were not a part of Islam, but because they had just some part of Islam, with just the parts that they did have, so many people came to Islam. And many of them at that time were African Americans. This is one of the first times that Islam is being on everyone's tongue. It's on the news and everything, and people are hearing about this group and these people. They call themselves Muslims in this country. Later on, around the time when Malcolm X was the spokesperson and speaking on behalf of the Nation of Islam, and he was someone who was well-spoken, well-traveled, and he traveled different places. It says when he went to Hajj, one of the times he began to separate from this group and he embraced Orthodox Islam. It says when he went to Hajj, he saw people from different colors, different nations, different backgrounds. They were all eating from the same plate, they were dressing in the same clothes as people do when they go to Hajj. So this was one of the first times that he began to learn more about true Islam. This was when a lot of people in America started to learn about Islam. So now we're entering after the time that he was assassinated and going into the 70s, many people began to come to Islam. Many people who were American, they began to learn about Islam. After this time, we find that there's a large amount of people coming from other countries, from Shia countries, coming from countries like Iraq, like Pakistan, like Lebanon, and for Lebanon for many years actually, which is why we have so many, some Lebanese who've been here for several generations, and from other Muslim countries in that area, and coming to the United States. Many of them as students, many of them to open a business, or for other reasons. So what happens is during this time, while people are coming here to this country, away from their normal country, away from their language, away from their customs, away from a lot of their religion, this is when they first begin to establish centers and masajid for the followers of the Ahlul Bayt. Because I want to look at and talk about and explain a little bit about the history of the Ahlul Bayt and Shia Islam in America. to help us to better understand what we have in the advent of the event of Karbala, the tragedy of Karbala, and how it affects us today. During this time when people were coming from different countries, they wanted to establish a place that they could remember their religion. So they set up centers. They set up places where they would gather together, and they would meet together, and they would have programs. They would have programs during Ramadan, mourn for Imam Hussain, and this is where the communities begin to grow, and they begin to flourish. Now, something changed over the course of time. The way that it started out was many of the programs that started 30 years ago, they were all in a specific language, whether they were in Urdu, or they were in Arabic, or they were in Farsi, for the most part. And over the course of time, what happened was this served a need, it served the purpose. It served the purpose of people who spoke that language having a way to learn about their religion, or keep their religion, or maintain their customs, or keep their tradition. But then things changed. They had children. Their children were born here. Their children were being raised here. Their children were identifying with this culture and this language. For many of the children, their first language became English. And their identity became maybe more American than their back home identity, or their parents' identity, or their heritage. So now they have this common factor in that they're followers of the Ahlul Bayt, but now there's a new culture that's being developed, or a new people, a new breed. Also at the same time, there is an influx of people coming to Islam and learning about the followers of the Ahlul Bayt, learning about the Ahlul Bayt, learning about what does it mean to be a Shia? Who are these people? So now we have a time in the 70s and going to the 80s where a lot of people are coming to Islam, more people are learning about the Ahlul Bayt, more people are becoming politically aware. The Islamic revolution in Iran was one of the first times that people begin to hear about this Shia, or these followers of the Ahlul Bayt, and who are they? So this made a lot of people research. It made them learn, it made them study. So many Americans at this time, like my parents, they became followers of the Ahlul Bayt. And many people, their children were being brought and raised here. So now the need changed from needing to just have a program and a specific language to being able to educate the next generation, to being able to have things to facilitate the education of the people coming to Islam whose native tongue was also English. So then we saw a transition and a development where now, as we see today in most places in the US, there's programs usually in English, or there's programs in dual languages, in 2 languages, to serve the needs that the community has. Now, this brings me to my point about one very important aspect of the month of Muharram, and that is the aspect of Azah and mourning. That is the culture of mourning, or the culture of poetry, the culture of marthiyah, the culture of qasidas, the culture of matam and noha and latmiyat. This is a culture that became a part of many other cultures. After Imam Hussain alayhi salam was martyred, and the shuhada at Karbala were martyred, and what happened? This is when people really truly begin to create this culture of azah and mourning for Imam Hussain. And people begin to beat their chests. And people begin to write poetry more about the Ahlul Bayt. Now, there was poetry always recited. When the Prophet of Allah came, some people, they said, you're a poet, you're a shair, you're just a poet, you're not a messenger. Because of the Quran being so beautiful, they said maybe the Prophet of Allah is a poet. Poetry was very common amongst the Arab culture at that time. Everyone, if they were a poet, then they were one of the well-respected people. Poetry was very common amongst, for example, the Persian culture. It was very often, there are many types of poets. Even today, in the building in New York, the United Nations building, they have one of the famous Persian poets, Sa'di. One of his verses is on the wall of the United Nations building. It says that Bani Adam a'zai digaran ke dar aferinsh ze yek goharan. That man, mankind, they are like members of one another, their body, limbs of one another. But in their creation, they have the same essence. And this poem, this verse or this bait from this poem is on the wall of the United Nations. So amongst Persian culture, historically, there has been a lot of poetry. Sometimes you hear people and they say, well, you can't do these things in English. You can't do matam in English, you can't do nohaz in English, or you can't say poetry in English, and you can't do marthi in English, and so on and so forth. So this is where this culture and how it changed, and how people learn, and how there's a need to develop this as well. It means that there's a need for people to write, for people to read, for people to recite, for people to practice, to make this become a part of the culture in this country. Sometimes parents, when I do some consulting or talking with parents, they say, I want my kids to have the love for Islam that I have. I want them to mourn and beat their chest and have the same connection with Azan that I have. You have to create the environment. You have to make the environment. Some people, if they didn't begin in any language, in Arabic, there was a time when no one had ever written a word of Azan, a word in this way about Karbala, because it did not happen yet. But after it happened, the writers, the lovers of the Ahlul Bayt, they made a culture of poetry and remembrance in that language. And then the same thing happened in other languages. And so I want to remind you about something that's interesting. Historically, in India, for example, the official language of India at one time was Farsi. Farsi was the official language of India. And it was the language of majalis. So even though people, maybe they had their own dialect in other languages, when they wanted to have a majlis of Imam Hussain or something like this, they would always have it in Farsi. And then when people wanted to have, for example, in Urdu language, poetry or noha, people would say, you can't do poetry in Urdu. They would laugh at them. They say, you can't do nohas in Urdu. You can't do this in this language. Because at that time, the language of the majalis was in Farsi in this country, in that region. And so that changed. But how did it change? It changed because some people, they began to write poetry. Some people in Urdu, they loved the Ahlul Bayt and they wrote poetry. There's two very, very famous poets that are Urdu-speaking poets. One is called Mirza Anis and Mirza Ali Dabir. These are two very, very famous Urdu-speaking poets. At this time, it says that about them that when they were children, they were learning and writing poetry about the Ahlul Bayt when they were children. And there was a time when this was something that nobody did. They said it can't be done. So brothers and sisters, I want to remind us that if we want for our children, for them to develop with the confidence of a believer, with the confidence of the ashab of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, then we have to help that culture to transition into this culture. The culture of azan and mourning and poetry has to become a part of this culture. The same as it was for Urdu speaking, for Persian speaking, for any other language. It became a process. And it starts by teaching the youth and asking them, you write poetry about Imam Hussain. You love Imam Hussain? You know about him? Write about him. write in the words of this language. And this is when the development will happen and a new cultural change will happen in this country. It will be like a revolution. So on that note, I want to remind us also about a hadith which talks about the person who says a single bait, a single verse of poetry. There's a hadith that says, "Man qala fina bayt ash-shir," a single verse. "Bana Allah ta'ala lahu baytan fil jannah." Allah places for that person who writes one verse about the Ahl al-Bayt, one house in paradise. So, mashallah to all of those who take the time to write poetry or even to just read the poetry in any language. But I have a special expectation, and I want to encourage especially the youth or anyone who has the ability to write a poem in English, to write a martiya in English, to do that. That will be one of the greatest contributions to spreading the message of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. One of the greatest contributions. Till today, people are reciting poetry someone wrote 100 years ago. Till today. And they get the thawab. This mustamar continues. And the person who writes the poetry today in English till 100 years, or as long as people are in this world, they will receive the ajr and the benefit for that as well. And I want to encourage all of the youth to write some poetry during this Muharram about Karbala and about Imam Hussain. And for any of you that do, I would like to personally make sure that you receive a reward and a prize for showing your love for Imam Hussain alayhi salam. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all tawfiq and success to be those true companions of our Imam Mahdi Ajalallah ta'ala Farajuhu Sharif. May Allah hasten his return. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.